Title: The Ascendant's Descent. Chapter 1: The Arrival. James had always believed that buildings, like people, carried their histories with them, heavy, invisible weights that seeped through walls, floors, and ceilings. Perhaps it was the years of crumbling brick and splintering wood, the faint scent of mildew and old dust that filled every corner. Or maybe it was the strange way the light seemed to fall in uneven, broken patterns, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the floor. But the apartment was cheap, and that's what had mattered when he'd been looking for a place to settle in the new city. After all, he had just moved in, a fresh start, the promise of independence after years of coasting between family and friends in distant cities. He hadn't expected much: a roof, 4 walls, and a floor beneath his feet. He hadn't expected to be haunted. The building stood on the edge of town, a decaying relic in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The streets around it were empty, save for the occasional haggard soul stumbling down the cracked sidewalks. It wasn't much, but that was fine by James. After years of living out of suitcase, he needed solitude. The landlord, a wiry, grey-haired man with eyes too wide for comfort, had shown him the apartment. He'd been curt, quick to hand over the keys and tell James everything he needed to know. "Don't mind the noise," he had said, his lips curling into a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just the building settling." James had taken the keys and nodded, more out of politeness than belief. What was a little noise after all? Noise, he thought, was nothing compared to the isolation he'd been yearning for. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. The building had a strange layout: long corridors that curved slightly, and narrow stairwells that creaked underfoot as though they were tired of carrying people up and down. The air in the hallway had a damp, musty quality, as though the building had never fully woken from a long, deep sleep. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, a pattern of swirling vines and flowers that seemed to twist unnaturally, as if they were reaching toward him, trying to grab at his coat sleeves as he walked past. It was a design that seemed to mock the very notion of comfort. Too gaudy, too old. The smell of dust lingered in the air, pungent and suffocating. And though he could feel the weight of the building pressing in around him, he tried to ignore it. When he entered the apartment, he was relieved to find it larger than he expected. It was bare, save for a few battered old furniture pieces that had been left behind. The floorboards were uneven, creaking underfoot with every step he took, but there was something oddly charming about it. He wondered briefly if he could fix it up, make it his own, but the thought quickly slipped away. The apartment had 2 large windows, one facing the street and the other an alley. He chose the one by the alley. The air from outside was damp, chilled with the scent of mildew and decay. He was only planning on staying for a few months, but something about the apartment made him feel as though it had been waiting for him. That night, as James settled into his new life, he couldn't shake the feeling that the building was watching him. The air seemed to grow heavier, as though the walls were listening, waiting. It began subtly, scraping sounds in the walls, faint and nearly imperceptible at first, like the shuffling of rats or the movement of someone unseen, just out of reach. He tried to ignore it, assuming it was just the house settling, as the landlord had said. But then there were footsteps, slow, deliberate, just above his ceiling, pacing back and forth. James had no roommates, no neighbors, yet the sounds persisted. Soft, steady, like the tread of someone who had nothing else to do but wander. It was a sound that grew louder every night, until it became impossible to ignore. He tried to tell himself it was nothing more than the usual sounds of an old building, but a small, gnawing part of him started to wonder. What if something else was in the building? That night, he decided to investigate. The halls of the building were dark and silent, save for the creaking of the old wood beneath his feet. The lights in the hallway flickered as he walked, casting long, jagged shadows on the peeling wallpaper. There were no other signs of life, no other doors opening or closing, no footsteps following his own. Yet the air was thick with a palpable sense of waiting. He paused in front of the door to the apartment next door. No lights, no sounds. It looked deserted, the door slightly ajar. He knocked. Silence. He tried the next door. And the next. They were all the same. No lights. No response. The hallway seemed longer than it should be, stretching away into darkness at both ends. and James felt as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a wrong move. As he turned back toward his apartment, something caught his eye. A figure, a woman, pale and thin, standing at the far end of the hall. She was watching him, her back turned, her long hair falling in waves over her shoulders, obscuring her face. For a moment, he thought she was a ghost, a figment of his imagination. But as he took a step closer, he saw the faintest movement. She wasn't standing still. She was breathing. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice sounding small in the empty space. She didn't respond. James hesitated, unsure whether to approach. The air grew colder, and he felt the weight of the building's presence pressing in on him. He stepped forward, each footstep echoing too loudly in the silence. "Are you okay?" he asked again, trying to steady his voice. But as he neared, the woman slowly turned her head to face him, and James froze. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, black as the night. There was something wrong with them, something ancient and hollow. And her smile, it was a smile that didn't belong to a human being, too wide, too stretching, as though it had been carved from her face by something other than flesh. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, a soft, shrill whistling noise filled the air. The walls seemed to groan, the building shifting, as if it was alive and aware of the conversation taking place. Then, without warning, she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone, like smoke dissipating in the wind. James stood frozen in the hallway, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The silence returned, but it was different now, thick, suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around him. He quickly turned and fled back into his apartment, locking the door behind him. His heart raced, the sound of it thumping in his ears. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker now, deeper, as though something was waiting for him to blink. The temperature in the apartment had dropped, the chill crawling across his skin, making him shiver uncontrollably. He could hear the muffled sound of footsteps again, this time closer, louder. They were coming from the hallway outside. He stumbled toward the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains. But all he could see was the street below, empty and dark. No one was there. The footsteps outside grew louder still, and this time there was no doubt. Someone was walking down the hallway toward his door. James backed away, his hand fumbling for his phone, but his fingers shook too violently to dial. The footsteps stopped just outside his door. And then a knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. James's heart skipped a beat. The building had just begun to speak to him, and it had no intention of letting him go. Chapter 2. The Unseen Presence. The knocking did not stop. It echoed through the apartment, its rhythm slow and deliberate, as though someone was carefully considering each strike, taking their time to torment him. James stood frozen in the center of his living room, his eyes wide, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The door loomed in front of him, as if it were some great malevolent thing, daring him to open it. But he couldn't. The fear was too much. It was a primal thing, that cold dread which crawls up from the depths of your spine. Something that tells you not to move, not to breathe, not to make a sound. The knocking grew louder. Knock, knock, knock. James felt as though the walls were closing in, pressing him closer and closer to the door. His breath came in shallow gasps, his fingers numb as they gripped the edge of the nearby table for support. Sweat clung to his skin, and his thoughts were jumbled. There was no reason for this. There was no one out there. It was just his mind playing tricks on him. It had to be. The landlord had warned him about the noise, about how old buildings sometimes made strange sounds. Surely that's all this was. But as the knocks persisted, he could feel something inside him unraveling, like a thread slowly being pulled from the fabric of his sanity. Finally, the knocking stopped. There was silence, a silence that stretched out like the edge of a blade, sharp and endless. James held his breath, listening for any sign of movement, any sound that would confirm that he was not alone. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the only thing that seemed alive in the room. Tick, tick, tick. He turned, his gaze lingering on the door, half expecting it to burst open with some unspeakable horror on the other side. The silence felt suffocating, as though the building itself had held its breath with him, waiting to see what he would do next. His legs felt unsteady, as though they were made of something less than human. His feet dragged as he moved toward the door, an inexplicable force urging him forward. He reached the door, the cold handle like ice beneath his hand. His heart thundered in his chest. He hesitated. With a slow, deliberate motion, he turned the handle and cracked the door open. Nothing. The hallway stretched out in front of him, empty, lifeless. The flickering overhead light cast long, thin shadows on the walls. The air was damp, the scent of mildew even stronger now, as if the building was breathing in the darkness. The hallway looked wrong. It wasn't just the shadows, nor the unnatural stillness. It was as if the walls themselves had shifted slightly, moved without him noticing, rearranged their positions as though they had minds of their own. The faint outline of the corner at the end of the hallway no longer lined up with the rest of the architecture. James stepped cautiously out into the corridor, his bare feet barely making a sound on the old, creaking floorboards. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to lock himself inside his apartment. But something, curiosity maybe, or the hopelessness that came with being trapped in this place, pushed him onward. He reached the end of the hallway, his hand trailing along the wall, fingers brushing against the cracked paint. And then he saw it. At the far end of the hall, the door to an apartment he knew hadn't been there before was standing slightly ajar. The number, 3B, had never been there. He was certain of it. He had walked down this hallway several times, and there had never been a door here, not in the spot where this one now stood. 3B. The door looked different from the others. The paint was chipped and peeling, but there was something strangely inviting about it. The air seemed to hum around it, as if it were charged with some invisible force. The knob, unlike the others, was tarnished with rust, like it hadn't been touched in decades. James felt a strange pull toward it, as if the door were calling to him, whispering his name with an urgency he couldn't quite place. He moved closer, his steps slow, deliberate, each footfall a small betrayal of the deep, primal fear that gripped him. When he reached the door, he paused, staring at the tarnished handle. For a moment he simply stood there, transfixed. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that his breath fogged in front of his face. A low, guttural hum filled the hallway, so quiet that it was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once noticed. It was like the hum of an ancient machine, deep, reverberating, and filled with an oppressive weight. With trembling fingers, he turned the handle. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning as if they hadn't been used in years. The room beyond was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallowed light whole, leaving nothing behind but an endless void. Then, something moved inside. Something that wasn't quite human. A cold gust of wind blew past him, as though something had just exhaled. The temperature dropped further, and James instinctively stepped back, his body tensing. The darkness seemed to shift, and in that shifting, something was watching him. Something that had always been there, lurking just out of view. Suddenly the floor beneath him seemed to groan in protest, the wood beneath his feet creaking as though it were about to give way. James stumbled back toward his apartment, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his heart pounding in his ears. The walls seemed to close in on him as he retreated, his mind a chaotic blur of panic and disbelief. As he reached his door, he glanced back down the hallway. The door to 3B was gone. It was as if it had never existed. The hallway was now empty, unchanged, as though it had always been this way. The door that had beckoned to him had simply vanished into thin air. James closed the door to his apartment behind him, his breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. He leaned against the door, struggling to regain his bearings. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The door had been there, he was certain of it. And yet, now it was gone. Nothing but an empty hallway. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been marked, that he had seen something that wasn't supposed to be seen, something that wasn't part of the world he knew. The knocking began again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent, and it came from inside the apartment. James turned slowly, his eyes wide with terror. The sound was unmistakable, coming from behind him, somewhere within the apartment. It was not at the door, not from the hallway, but from the very walls of the place. The walls themselves seemed to be breathing, pulsing with some unseen rhythm. He moved toward the sound, his body moving on its own, as if it were being pulled by some force stronger than his will. He reached the center of the room, and the knocking stopped. But then, a whisper, faint, nearly inaudible. "Come to me." James stumbled backward, his hand reaching for the nearest thing to steady himself. His fingers brushed against the cold metallic surface of the old lamp on the table beside him. He quickly turned and looked around, but there was nothing there. The whisper was gone, but the sensation remained. Something was inside the walls, waiting, watching, calling him closer. He had been drawn into something far beyond his understanding, and it was only just beginning. The hallway becomes a labyrinth. Unable to stay still, James slowly made his way to the window, trying to ground himself in the outside world. He peeled back the thick curtains, peering into the street below. The familiar view was gone. Where he had once seen the dim glow of streetlights and the shadow of old houses, now there was only emptiness. The street had disappeared. In its place was a cold void. Blackness stretched endlessly beyond the window. He stepped back, his heart beginning to pound again, a sense of vertigo gripping him. The familiar street was gone, replaced by nothingness. He stumbled away from the window, glancing nervously at the door to his apartment. The very foundation of his reality was crumbling. The hallway, the door to 3B, the knocking. It was all starting to spiral into something he couldn't make sense of. The apartment had taken on a life of its own, and he was being drawn into its depths. In a fit of panic, James grabbed his coat and left the apartment, determined to get out of the building. He was done. He needed to leave. The hallways twisted as he moved, the angles all wrong. The walls seemed to bow inward, the narrow passages distorting in impossible ways. No matter which direction he took, it felt as if he was walking in circles. The familiar layout of the building was now alien. Each turn he took only brought him deeper into the bowels of the place. Then he saw it again. The door, 3B. It had appeared at the end of the hallway once more, this time fully open. The darkness inside was an oppressive weight, as though it were pulling him toward it. Slowly but inexorably, James stumbled toward the door without even realizing what he was doing. A low, guttural whisper reached his ears from the dark interior. "Come in, come closer." He wanted to run, to turn back, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs moved on their own, carrying him forward. The air grew colder with each step. And then, a voice, clearer this time, but with a tone of finality. "You cannot leave." In this extended chapter, we explore more of the psychological horror and supernatural dread enveloping James. The eerie occurrences intensify, making the line between reality and nightmare blur even further. The atmosphere thickens, and James's descent into madness begins as he experiences the full extent of the apartment's malevolent presence. Each moment is marked by increasing tension, eerie sounds, and an unsettling feeling of being watched and controlled by forces beyond his comprehension. Chapter 3. The Binding Shadows. James awoke with a start, his breath shallow, his body drenched in sweat. The nightmares had not ceased, they had only evolved. The shadows from his dreams had bled into the waking world, each movement in his apartment now accompanied by the sense of eyes watching him from unseen corners. The weight of something unseen lingered in the air, like the pressure of a storm waiting to break. He was no longer sure if it was day or night. The apartment, always shrouded in a sickly glow from the dim bulbs overhead, had lost its concept of time. There were no windows, no clear boundaries between the inside and outside worlds. The walls, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a prison, closing in on him with each passing hour. The silence, too, had become oppressive, an abyss that demanded attention, echoing in his mind. James could still hear the knocking. It wasn't just the faint tap of his neighbours' doors. No, this was something far more insistent. It was a rhythmic sound, methodical, deliberate. It came from the walls themselves, deep, hollow knocks, as if the building were alive, breathing with a hunger that it could no longer suppress. Knock, knock, knock. It seemed to come from every direction at once, from beneath the floorboards, above the ceiling, from inside the walls. He had long since stopped looking for the source. The knocking was everywhere, all around him, deafening and impossible to escape. He was trapped in this cursed space, with no way out. James pushed himself out of bed, his body trembling, the sheets falling from him like the remnants of a long-forgotten dream. His mind was clouded with confusion, his thoughts drifting in and out of focus. His chest felt heavy, as if the very air was pressing down on him, suffocating him. He moved toward the door with slow, hesitant steps. The knocking continued. He could hear it clearly now, each strike coming closer, as if it were calling him. He hesitated for a moment, gripping the doorknob tightly, feeling the icy chill of the metal against his palm. His heart raced. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and opened the door. The hallway was empty. It always seemed to be empty, yet it felt like a place full of secrets, full of things that didn't belong. The faint flickering light at the far end of the hall only made the shadows darker, more oppressive. He had tried to leave the building once before, but no matter which direction he went, the hallway twisted, the doors and corners rearranging themselves in ways that defied logic. The hallway was not the same as when he had first moved in. The walls seemed to have grown more distorted, more oppressive, as if they were leaning in on him, narrowing the passageway. The floor creaked beneath his weight, as though it were alive, testing his resolve, daring him to step further. Then he heard it, a whisper. Faint at first, like the flutter of a moth's wings, but unmistakable. It was a voice, soft and insistent, calling to him from the shadows at the end of the hallway. Come closer. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't sure whether he was hearing the voice inside his head or if it was coming from the darkened corners of the building. The voice was both alien and familiar, as if it knew him, knew his every thought and fear. He stepped forward, drawn toward it, though his mind screamed at him to turn back. The shadows seemed to reach out to him, tendrils of darkness that writhed and slithered along the walls. The temperature in the hallway had dropped, and a cold wind began to stir, making the air feel even heavier, more suffocating. With each step, the voice grew louder. Come closer, James. He moved forward despite the voice, despite the pull in his chest that told him to stop. He had no choice. He had to know what it was. He had to confront whatever force had taken root in this cursed place. The door at the end of the hallway loomed before him. He didn't recognize it. This was not the same door he had seen before, the one that had disappeared after he'd glimpsed it. This was different. Its surface warped and twisted as if something had been scratching at it from the inside. A dark, oily substance ran down the doorframe, dripping onto the floor in thick, viscous streams. The air around the door seemed to warp and ripple, as if reality itself were buckling beneath the weight of whatever lay beyond. James reached for the handle, feeling a cold jolt of energy course through him as his fingers touched it. The metal was slick, unnaturally smooth, as though it had been polished with something far darker than mere polish. He turned the knob. The door creaked open. Beyond it was darkness, a heavy, suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch forever. James couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything. The absence of sound was deafening. Yet, as his eyes adjusted, he felt something, a presence, cold and ancient, stirring within the blackness, watching him. The air inside the room was thicker than anything he had ever felt. It clung to his skin, suffocating him, as if it was not meant for the living. A sudden chill gripped his spine, making the hair on his neck stand on end. He stepped forward, each movement slow, as though the very room was pulling him into its depths. Come closer, James. The voice whispered again, now louder, more urgent, more insistent. He took another step, and then the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The room was cold, impossibly cold, colder than the deepest winter nights. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of old wood, mildew, and something far worse, something that didn't belong to the natural world. James could barely see, but he felt the presence all around him, in the corners, in the air, in the very walls of the room. The shadows seemed to move, to twitch, as if something were crawling just out of sight. And then he saw it. A figure, standing in the far corner of the room, cloaked in the deepest black. Its outline was shifting, undulating, as if it were made of liquid darkness itself. The figure did not move, but James could feel its eyes on him. The air grew heavier, as though the weight of its gaze was pressing down on him. "You are mine now." The voice spoke again, but this time, it was not the whisper of the shadows. It was clear, sharp, and filled with a terrible finality. James tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body felt numb, like it had turned to stone. Panic surged through him, but it was too late. The darkness surged forward, swallowing him whole. The return. James awoke with a jolt, gasping for air, his body slick with cold sweat. He was back in his apartment, the room still and silent, as if nothing had happened. He blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The door was closed. The walls were still, unmoving. But the feeling of something watching him, something lurking just beyond his vision, was still there. The knocking began again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was different. It wasn't just from the walls. It was coming from within his mind. It echoed in the back of his skull, reverberating in his thoughts, an incessant, maddening noise. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape the presence. James stood, trembling, staring at the door. The hallway beyond was no longer just a hallway. It had become something else, something alive, a labyrinth that shifted and twisted in ways he couldn't understand. He could feel the walls closing in, the space growing tighter with each passing second. The shadows were alive, and they were reaching for him. They wanted him. The door to 3B wasn't gone. It had followed him into his mind, into his soul. The knocking came again, louder this time, shaking the very foundations of the apartment. Knock, knock, knock. And this time, there was no turning back. In this extended chapter, we delve deeper into James's psychological unraveling as he faces the overwhelming presence of the building and its malevolent forces. His reality warps around him as he confronts the impossible darkness within the apartment, and he is forced into an inescapable spiral of terror. The shadows, both external and internal, continue to haunt him, and he is unable to distinguish between the waking world and the nightmare that continues to consume him. The sense of entrapment becomes more suffocating, and his fear grows more profound as he learns that escaping this place may be impossible. Chapter 4. The Convergence. James woke up, or at least he thought he did. His eyes snapped open, but nothing felt real anymore. The air around him was thick, heavy with a palpable weight that pressed down on his chest. His body was frozen in place, his limbs numb. It wasn't the kind of numbness you get from being cold. No, this was something deeper, something that came from the very marrow of his bones. His skin felt tight, like it no longer belonged to him, as though something inside him had been replaced by something that was not quite human. The apartment, too, had changed. It was as if the room had shifted subtly, distorting the space around him. The furniture that had once been in place, simple and utilitarian, had morphed into something unfamiliar, like the belongings of someone he didn't know, someone who had never lived here. The walls seemed closer, as if they had crept in while he slept, suffocating him in their insistent proximity. The temperature had dropped, the air now biting with a coldness that went beyond physical sensation. His breath came out in slow, deliberate plumes, and the silence was absolute, thick enough to choke on. James tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't obey him. The paralysis was deeper now, more ingrained, as if the force that held him had seeped into the very fabric of his being. Panic began to rise in his chest, a tight knot that twisted and pulled at his throat. But then, just as suddenly as the paralysis had come, it receded. His limbs were free, but the weight of something else remained. The knocking began again. Knock, knock, knock. It was different this time, closer, more insistent, as though the force behind it were no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be a subtle presence. It was coming from inside the apartment itself, from the walls, from the floor beneath him, as though the very building was alive and aware of his movements. The sound reverberated through his bones, shaking him from the inside out. It wasn't a simple knock. It was an invitation, a command. James stood up shakily, his legs unsteady beneath him. He didn't know where to go anymore, didn't know what to do. The walls seemed to pulse, and the shadows that clung to the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, stretching out toward him, as though reaching for his very soul. He felt the presence again, the one that had been with him since he had entered the apartment. It was inside him now, suffocating him, wrapping its cold, invisible fingers around his mind. He could hear it whispering, faint but clear, "You are mine." James took a step forward, then another, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't sure if he was still in control of his body or if something else was moving him. His fingers brushed the walls, feeling their texture, the faint vibrations of the knocks emanating from within them. The apartment was a maze now, a labyrinth that was constantly shifting, twisting into shapes he couldn't comprehend. The door to the hallway stood before him. He had to leave. He had to escape this nightmare. But the moment his hand touched the handle, a wave of dread washed over him, as if the very air around the door had become poison. He withdrew his hand, feeling the oppressive weight of the unseen force pressing against his chest. And then, it happened. The door to 3B appeared in front of him. He hadn't seen it before. It had never been here, not in this place, not in this hallway, but now it was there, standing as if it had always been. The number 3B was etched into the wood, worn and faded as though it had been there for centuries. The dark, oily substance that had leaked from the door earlier was now running down the frame in thick, viscous rivulets, pooling at the base of the door like blood. James stood frozen. He could feel the air around him thickening, the room closing in on him as he stared at the door. The presence behind it, the force that had been pulling at him, whispering to him, calling his name, was stronger than ever now. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was real. It was there, tangible, and it was waiting for him. He reached for the door handle again, and this time, his hand didn't hesitate. The moment his fingers closed around the cold metal, a sharp pain shot through his arm. It was as if the door itself was burning him, its touch searing through his skin and into his very bones. He cried out, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the thick silence of the apartment. The pain intensified, coursing through his body like liquid fire, but still, he couldn't pull his hand away. The door creaked open on its own, as though something inside was pushing against it, urging him to enter. And then, he saw it. Inside the room was darkness, but it wasn't like any darkness he had ever encountered. It was alive, shifting and moving, as if the very air in the room was made of shadows. The shadows seemed to reach out toward him, stretching and coiling like serpents, waiting to ensnare him. The darkness was thick, suffocating, and it seemed to pulse with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent. And then, he heard it, the whisper again, louder this time. "Come!" The darkness seemed to beckon him, drawing him in with an irresistible pull. His body moved forward against his will, his legs carrying him into the room, the floor beneath him creaking and groaning in protest. He didn't want to go in. He didn't want to take another step. But the presence was overwhelming. The shadows were already wrapping around him, pulling at his mind, dragging him deeper into the void. The door slammed shut behind him. The room was pitch black, the air thick and suffocating. The floor beneath him was soft like mud, and his feet sank into it with each step. The walls were close now, pressing in on him, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward him, as though they were alive, moving with purpose. He stumbled forward, his hands reaching out blindly in front of him, but there was nothing to hold on to. There was only the oppressive weight of the darkness, the suffocating silence, and the whispers that were now so loud in his mind that they drowned out all other thoughts. "You are mine!" The voice echoed, this time from all around him, surrounding him, smothering him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was no longer his own, and the force that had been pulling him into this room was now pulling at his very soul. "You belong to me now." The room seemed to twist, to bend, the walls warping and shifting in ways that defied all reason. The floor beneath him gave way, and he was falling into the darkness, deeper and deeper, until he felt as if he were being swallowed whole. And then, there was nothing, as may. James awoke again, or at least, he thought he did. The room was different. It was the same apartment, but it was no longer his. The walls were now covered in something slick and black, a substance that seemed to crawl and shift like living tar. The floor was slick with it, and the air smelled of decay, of rot, of something ancient and hungry. The knocking began again, but this time it was no longer just the walls. It came from the very ground beneath him, as though the building itself was alive, breathing, pulsating with an energy that was both unnatural and terrifying. Knock, knock, knock. James stumbled to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. He could feel the presence again, that cold, suffocating force surrounding him, wrapping itself around his mind and soul. It was here. It was everywhere. There was no escaping it now. He turned toward the door, but it was no longer a door. It was a gate, a gateway into something else, something far darker than he could have imagined. The shadows that had once been confined to the corners of the room were now moving, crawling across the walls, reaching for him, pulling at him, dragging him toward the gate. He could hear the whispers again, clearer this time, more insistent. "You are mine." The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if something on the other side was desperate to get in. The walls around him seemed to pulse with the force of it, the very fabric of the apartment shaking as though it were about to collapse. James could feel the darkness closing in around him, could feel it seeping into his very being. The gate was open now, and he knew, with a terrible clarity, that there was no way back, no escape. And as he stepped toward the gate, the shadows stretched out to greet him, their cold fingers wrapping around his body, pulling him into the void. There would be no escape from the building, no escape from 3B. Chapter 5. The Hollowing. James woke to darkness, but it wasn't just the absence of light. The darkness in his apartment had a quality to it now, a substance. It pressed down on him, filling the room like something solid, something that could be felt with the skin. It was no longer merely the absence of illumination, but a presence that surrounded him, a thickening fog of dread and despair. His eyes darted around the room, the unfamiliar corners now looming larger, the walls closer than ever. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, and his chest felt as though it were caving in with every passing second. The silence, too, had changed. It was no longer a comforting void. It was suffocating, a pressure on his ears, making every sound, a footstep, a creak, his own breathing, feel like it was reverberating across the entire universe. And then he heard it, the first whisper, "James." It came from nowhere, yet it was everywhere. It was as if the word was written into the very air around him, drawn from the spaces between his thoughts, etched into the very walls of the apartment. The room seemed to pulse with the sound, and he felt a sharp ache in his temples, a throbbing pressure that grew with each heartbeat. "James, come closer." He knew that voice. It was not the voice of a person. It was something ancient, something otherworldly, something that could not be defined. But he knew it, deep down in the marrow of his bones, and it wanted him. James sat up in a blur of movement, his body tense, ready to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment had become a labyrinth, a twisted maze of corridors that shifted every time he turned his head. The hallway had swallowed him, had devoured his sense of time and place. The once familiar layout had become a cruel joke, each door now appearing where it never had before, each hallway leading to more corridors. The walls had changed too. They seemed to lean toward him, as though closing in, pressing tighter and tighter with each passing second. It wasn't just the apartment anymore. The building itself had become part of him, its pulse matching the frantic rhythm of his heart. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Come, come closer." James stood, his legs shaking beneath him. The floor beneath his feet was slick, as though coated in some unseen film. He stumbled toward the door, each step echoing louder in the silence, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, a jarring noise split the air. The knocking had returned. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't just at the door anymore. It was everywhere. It came from the walls, from the ceiling, from under the floorboards, as if the building itself were alive, hungry, and angry. The noise vibrated through his bones, each knock a sharp, jarring beat in the symphony of terror. He pulled the door open. The hallway beyond was no longer familiar. It was a chasm, a never-ending void that seemed to stretch endlessly into blackness. The lights flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows that writhed and danced along the walls, contorting into grotesque shapes. The walls had begun to shift too, not in the way they had before, but with a terrible and deliberate purpose. They were breathing, slow, rhythmic pulses that seemed to vibrate beneath his feet. James felt the presence again, just behind him, creeping up from the darkness. The shadows were moving faster now, reaching for him with claws made of night. He could feel them in his lungs, like cold fingers curling around his breath, suffocating him with each step he took. "You can't leave." The voice, louder now, deeper, rumbled through the walls, shaking the very air around him. It wasn't just the apartment speaking to him. It was the building itself, the soul of the structure, something ancient and wicked that had been awakened. He turned his head, expecting to see something. A figure, a face, but there was nothing. Only the shifting shadows that seemed to swallow all light and form. The knocking continued, relentless and maddening. It had become a heartbeat now, a pulse that resonated with his very being, filling him, drowning him in its rhythm. Every part of his mind screamed for release, screamed for a way out, but his legs refused to move. The presence was too strong, the pressure too overwhelming. He stepped back, away from the door, and the shadows surged toward him, crawling across the floor like a swarm of insects. His skin prickled, and the air grew heavier still, as if something vast and insatiable was pressing against the very fabric of reality itself. "You're already here." The voice was now a chorus, coming from all directions at once, as though the very walls were speaking to him. It was no longer a whisper, but a low hum that thrummed through his body, vibrating in his chest, his head, his bones. It was inside him, making him feel as though he were drowning in it. "Come closer." James stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway was a tunnel now, a tight, suffocating shaft with no end, and the door to 3B had reappeared at the far end, its surface slick with that same black tar that had leaked out of it before. It was no longer just a door. It was a gateway, a tear in reality itself, a rift that would pull him in and never let him out. He felt the tug again, the same pull that had drawn him into this nightmare from the start. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was spiritual, a pull deep within him, as though the very core of his being was being drawn toward it. His body moved without his consent, each step heavier than the last, each movement like the last desperate push of a drowning man. The shadows were all around him now, crawling over his skin, seeping into his veins, twisting their cold fingers around his heart. The knocking, the whispering, the ever-present weight. It was all closing in on him, pressing tighter, tighter, until he couldn't breathe, until he couldn't think. He reached the door, and then he stepped inside. The room was different. The walls had melted, becoming something else entirely, a shifting mass of liquid darkness that pulsed and churned like the very essence of the void. The floor beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, as though it were made of flesh, warm, slick, and trembling. The air was thick with the stench of decay, with the smell of something ancient, of something that had never been allowed to die. The presence was here again, stronger now, more real than ever before. He could feel it around him, inside him, wrapping its tendrils around his soul. The door slammed shut behind him, and then the voice came again. "You belong to me now." The walls shifted, bending inward, the room folding in on itself. The shadows stretched out and became tangible, becoming arms, fingers, faces, grotesque, malformed and screaming without sound. They reached for him, caressing his skin, pulling at his limbs. The air grew thick with the weight of their touch, their coldness seeping into him, draining him of warmth and light. There is no escape. James tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was gone, swallowed by the darkness. His chest tightened with each breath, each moment heavier than the last. His heart was pounding in his ears. But the pressure of the darkness, the weight of the shadows, was too much. The walls closed in on him, and the floor beneath his feet gave way. He was falling again, tumbling through a black abyss, spinning and twisting in a never-ending spiral. His mind was unraveling, his thoughts dissolving into the void. And then there was nothing. James awoke, or thought he did. But the world around him was different. The room, the hallway, the apartment, they were all distorted now. The walls were shifting again, bending in impossible ways, as though the building itself was breathing, alive with a hunger that could not be sated. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something ancient and rotten. The knocking was louder now, louder than it had ever been before. It was inside him. The voice had become a part of him, a whisper that was no longer separate from his thoughts. It was his thoughts now, his very mind. "You are mine." James could feel it. He was no longer alone. He had never been alone. The apartment had claimed him. And now, there was nowhere left to run. Chapter 6. The Hollow Within. James awoke, or he thought he did, his eyes snapping open to a world that no longer felt familiar. The apartment was still there, of course, the familiar, oppressive four walls that had haunted him for what seemed like an eternity. But it was different now. The air was thick, thick with something heavy, something suffocating. The walls pressed in on him, closer and closer, and the air tasted foul, stale, like it had been trapped here for too long. He rubbed his eyes as if trying to clear away a fog he could not see, but the fog remained. It clung to the edges of his vision like smoke, distorting reality until he wasn't sure if he was even awake. He could still hear it, the sound of the building creaking, groaning beneath him, the faint whispers that had become the soundtrack of his life in this place. They had grown louder now, more insistent, like an audience waiting for a performance, waiting for him to fail. "James!" The whisper slid through his thoughts, curling like a snake around his consciousness. It was no longer just a voice. It was a presence, a dark entity that had wrapped itself around him, tightening its grip with each passing day. The words weren't words anymore. They were commands, born from the heart of the building, from the very bones of the apartment itself. James sat up, his limbs stiff and reluctant, as if they too were caught in the web of the apartment's dark influence. His mind was clouded, his thoughts fragmented. He tried to think, tried to focus, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. Every time he thought he had a hold on something, it slipped through his fingers, leaving him with only the remnants of his sanity. The apartment was alive. He had known it for a while now, but it was only in the last few days, or perhaps weeks. It was hard to tell anymore, that the truth had become undeniable. The building was a creature, a living thing, feeding off him, warping his mind, bending time and space in ways that defied all reason. The air itself felt charged, like the entire structure was pulsing with an ancient, malevolent energy, a hunger that could never be sated. And still, it called to him. "James, come closer." The whisper slithered into his ears, more intimate now, as if the building itself were speaking directly to his soul. He didn't want to listen. He didn't want to follow. But something inside him, something deep and primal, urged him to obey. He couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it. It was like his body was no longer his own. The apartment had taken control of him, had seeped into his bones, and now he was its prisoner. He pushed himself to his feet, stumbling as if the weight of the room itself was pushing down on him. The floor beneath him felt strange, soft, spongy, as if it were made of something alive, something that pulsed with each of his steps. It was a sensation he had never experienced before, and it made his skin crawl. He glanced down, half expecting to see some terrible, grotesque thing writhing beneath his feet. But there was nothing there, at least, nothing he could see. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly long and narrow. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air grew heavier with each breath. The shadows. God, the shadows. They seemed to shift and move on their own, stretching across the walls like long clawed fingers, reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the apartment's grip. James had learned long ago that the layout of the building was no longer fixed. It changed at will. Hallways became walls, rooms became doors, doors became windows. There was no logic to it, no consistency. It was as though the very fabric of the building itself was alive, shifting and warping, bending reality to its will. He passed by door after door, each one more familiar than the last, but each one leading him further into the nightmare. The knock came again, louder this time, as if it were coming from within his own mind. It rattled his skull, the sound of it like the beating of a heart too large, too loud, too insistent. Knock, knock, knock. The door at the end of the hallway appeared once more. 3B. It had become a fixture in his nightmares. It was no longer just a door, it was a symbol, a gateway to something terrible, something ancient, something dark that he could never escape. He didn't want to go near it. He couldn't bear to touch it, but his feet moved on their own, carrying him forward, as though some unseen force was guiding him. His hand reached for the handle, and he felt it. The same cold, biting sensation that shot up his arm whenever he got too close to the door. It was like the building itself was warning him, urging him not to go any further. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't move away. The door swung open without his touch. A dark, swirling mist billowed out from the room, thick and suffocating, like it had been trapped there for an eternity. The air was heavy with the smell of rot and decay, and the room beyond was a void, a black pit that seemed to swallow everything in sight. The walls were no longer walls. They had become something more, a mass of shifting shapes, of undulating shadows that stretched and twisted into grotesque forms. And the whispers, oh, the whispers were deafening now. You are here. You have always been here. James stepped forward, almost involuntarily. His legs were weak, his body trembling, but the pull was too strong. He could feel it now, the weight of the presence, the thing that had been following him, watching him. The shadows were alive, moving like serpents, crawling toward him, touching him with icy fingers that seemed to burn him from the inside out. His skin prickled, and every muscle in his body screamed for release, for escape. But there was no escape, not anymore. The door slammed shut behind him. The room closed in, the walls pressing against him, the shadows wrapping around him like chains, pulling him into the center of the room. He could no longer see. The darkness had consumed him, had swallowed him whole. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. But it wasn't enough. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. You are mine. The voice echoed in his mind, louder now, its power overwhelming. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence. It was the apartment, the building, the very thing that had claimed him the moment he set foot inside. It was alive, and it had always been alive. The walls, the floor, the air, everything was a part of it, a part of the thing that had ensnared him, that had pulled him into its grasp. Come closer. James could feel it now. The pull was unbearable. His body was being drawn toward the center of the room, toward the source of the darkness. He tried to fight it, but it was no use. His feet moved of their own accord, dragging him forward, deeper into the room, deeper into the belly of the apartment. The shadows reached for him, their tendrils curling around his limbs, their cold fingers sinking into his skin, into his flesh. He could feel them inside him now, spreading through his veins, suffocating him from the inside. You can't escape. The words reverberated through his skull, louder now, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The room spun around him, and the walls began to close in again, pressing down on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He was drowning in it, drowning in the darkness, in the very heart of the building. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. There was only the darkness. And then the door opened. The room was gone. The darkness was gone. The apartment was gone. James was standing in a new place, but he didn't know where. His mind was a blur, a fractured thing that he couldn't piece together. The walls were the same, black, oppressive, alive. But this was different. This was no longer an apartment. This was something worse. And the voice, oh, the voice was still there. "You belong to me now." James screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the abyss, lost in the infinite dark. There was no escape. There was no end. There was only the apartment, and it was hungry. Chapter 7. The feeding James awoke again, but it was not with the clarity of someone who had rested. No, this was something darker. He opened his eyes slowly, aware of the coldness that surrounded him, the heavy, oppressive air that pressed down on his chest. His breath came in shallow, quick gasps, and his heart thudded wildly in his ribcage as if it were fighting to escape his body. The room he found himself in was unfamiliar, but at the same time, it was all too familiar. The walls, no, the entire room, was made of something soft, shifting like flesh. The floor beneath him was slick, wet with a substance he couldn't name, but it smelled of rot, of something long dead and decayed. His head spun as he tried to sit up, but his limbs felt heavy, like they were submerged in a thick, viscous liquid. The shadows around him were moving, alive, stretching toward him like hungry hands reaching for their next meal. "You are here." The whisper came again, cutting through his foggy thoughts. It wasn't just in his mind now, it was in the very air, swirling around him, inside him. The voice was low and thick, like the hum of an ancient engine, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "You belong here." He didn't want to believe it, but he felt it in every fibre of his being. The truth, that terrible, undeniable truth. He had been pulled into this nightmare, this living entity. The apartment had claimed him. The building itself had become part of him, its hunger, its insatiable thirst for souls, now intertwined with his own. But how? How had this happened? Was this death? Was he dead? He tried to move again, but his body refused to obey. The ground beneath him shifted, pulling him further down, sucking him into the very foundation of the place. It was no longer a building. It was a body, an organism, and he was inside it. No longer a guest, but a parasite, a vessel for something far older, far darker. The walls groaned, as if the building itself was stretching, yawning, its tendrils spreading, growing, expanding. He could hear it now, the faint sound of things moving, crawling, writhing beneath the surface. It was as if the very bones of the apartment were alive, feeding, growing stronger with each passing moment. "You are not alone." James's heart skipped a beat, and his stomach twisted in terror. The words were clearer now, more distinct, as if they had been spoken by something standing just behind him, breathing in his ear. He turned, his head jerking in panic, and saw nothing but darkness, a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to pull him in deeper. But then, movement. A shadow, shifting in the corner of the room, slithering toward him. It wasn't like the others. This one was solid, humanoid, its outline jagged and indistinct, like it was made of smoke or tar. The figure seemed to grow taller, its form shifting and contorting with every passing second, as though it were a reflection in broken glass. James's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his tongue heavy, and his chest felt tight, as if the air itself were refusing to enter his lungs. The shadow crept closer, its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowing faintly, two slivers of pale light that seemed to pierce the darkness. There was something ancient about it, something primal, as though it had been here long before James ever stepped foot into the apartment. It was the manifestation of the building's hunger, its darkness made flesh. "You are not the first." The words echoed through his skull, and James's heart pounded in his chest. It was like a distant memory, a half-formed recollection of something terrible, something he had known but had tried to forget. The figure moved again, its form rippling, distorting, growing larger and more terrifying with each passing second. James could feel it now, a gnawing sensation deep in his gut, a hunger that matched the creature's, that echoed the building's insatiable thirst. "You are the next." The shadow reached out, its hand, if it could be called a hand, grasping for him, its fingers long and clawed, twisting as they drew closer. James tried to pull away, but the room itself was holding him in place. The walls had turned soft again, like wet flesh, and they were pressing in, crushing him, pushing him closer to the shadow, to the figure that was growing more and more real, more tangible, with every passing moment. There was no escape. You are mine. The words were a command, an affirmation. The figure's fingers were inches from his face now, and James felt them graze his skin, cold and slick like the wetness of a corpse. He recoiled, his body trembling, but there was nowhere to go. The room was a prison, and he was its captive. "Please," James whispered, though he knew it would do no good. He didn't even know who he was begging anymore. The building, the shadow, the voice in his head. All of it felt like one continuous entity, one unholy thing coiled around him, squeezing tighter, suffocating him with its presence. And then, the hand reached inside him. It wasn't physical. It didn't need to be. The shadow's touch was like the crushing weight of an ancient force, something that had existed long before the human race even thought of the concept of time. It burrowed deep within him, tearing through his thoughts, his memories, his very soul. The sensation was unbearable, like his very essence was being siphoned away, devoured piece by piece, consumed until there was nothing left but an empty shell. He could feel it, a pull, a draining, like his very life force was being drawn out of him. His body trembled, his vision blurred, and his mind fragmented, as if something was crawling into it, devouring everything that made him James. The weight of the building's presence pressed harder, its hunger gnawing at him, pulling him closer to its core, to the very heart of the darkness that had become his prison. "You are mine." The voice had become a song, a lullaby sung by the building, a promise that he was nothing now, nothing but a piece of its endless, insatiable hunger. It was taking him, consuming him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He was part of the apartment now, part of its eternal cycle of feeding, part of the darkness that had no end. And then, just when he thought he could bear no more, when he thought he was about to be swallowed whole, everything stopped. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was thick, suffocating. The shadows were still there, but they no longer moved. The air was still heavy, but it no longer felt as though it was closing in on him. James could feel his breath returning, slow and shaky, but it was not relief. It was something worse. He had been changed. Something had taken root inside him. He was still in the room, still in the apartment, but now he could feel it within him. The darkness, the hunger, it had become part of his soul. He was not alone anymore. "You belong to me now." The voice was quiet now, but it still echoed in his mind. He could hear it, feel it, deep inside, like a whisper of the building itself. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was its vessel, its extension. He was part of it now, and it would never let him go. James stood, his body moving on its own, no longer his own. He was no longer the man who had entered this place. He was something else, something darker. And the building had only just begun to feed. Chapter 8. The Infinite Hunger. James stumbled forward, his legs weak, his mind reeling with fragments of memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. The walls around him shifted in subtle, disorienting ways, contracting and expanding like the breath of a living creature. The air was thick with a sense of suffocating dread, as though the very atmosphere was closing in, tightening around him. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one harder to take than the last. The hunger within him was growing, gnawing at the pit of his stomach, crawling up his chest, wrapping around his heart. It was alive, this hunger, this building, and it was eating him, inch by inch, mind by mind, until he was no longer James. He could feel it in his body, in his very bones. It was not a passing sensation. It was something permanent, something deep. The walls, no, the very foundation of the building, pulsed with an almost palpable hunger. It felt like it was breathing, not just the building, but everything inside it, everything around him, the shadows, the walls, the rooms that stretched endlessly before him, changing and shifting, disorienting him as he wandered, lost. Where am I? The thought came unbidden, as though it didn't even belong to him. His mind felt foggy, clouded, distant. The confusion seemed to echo throughout the apartment, every thought dissipating before it could fully form. The hunger had begun to consume his thoughts, and soon there would be nothing left of him. He walked down a long corridor, one that seemed vaguely familiar but also completely foreign. The floor beneath his feet was slick, covered with something that could have been sweat or something worse, something organic. His hand brushed against the wall as he moved, and he felt it, a soft, pulsing throb that sent a jolt of unease through him. The building was alive, he realized. It wasn't just made of bricks and mortar. It was something more, something ancient, something vast. It was feeding, it was growing, and he was becoming part of it. With each step, his limbs felt heavier, as though they were no longer his own. His vision blurred, his senses distorting. He could no longer tell where his body ended and the building began. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, like the very atmosphere around him was charged with a dark energy, a power that wanted to consume, to twist, to devour. The hunger was growing inside him too. He could feel it, crawling beneath his skin, reaching into his mind. It was a gnawing sensation, persistent, insatiable. It was hungry, and it was his hunger now. The building had made him a part of it. He was no longer just a prisoner of the apartment. He was an extension of it, a vessel for its endless desire. Help me. The whisper came from somewhere in the darkness, distant but clear, almost pleading. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, searching the dim corridor for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, just more shadows, more empty space. The voice was in the walls, he realized. The building was speaking to him. The hunger was speaking to him. You will serve me. The words echoed through his mind, not spoken aloud, but felt, a cold pressure inside his skull, like the building itself was planting these thoughts, these commands, inside of him. He tried to shake it off, to focus, but the hunger inside him was relentless. His legs moved of their own accord, dragging him deeper into the labyrinth of the apartment. He couldn't stop. He couldn't think. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a figure, a vague outline in the distance. He blinked, trying to make sense of it, but as he drew closer, his blood ran cold. It was another person, or at least, it had been a person. The figure was hunched over, its body contorted, twisted beyond recognition. The skin was stretched thin over its bones, the eyes wide and empty, staring at him with a look of despair that chilled him to the core. James reached out, his hand trembling. Was this another soul trapped here, just like him? A victim of the building's endless hunger? But as he moved closer, he realized something far worse. The figure wasn't just a soul. It wasn't a person anymore. It was part of the building. The hunger had consumed it, twisted it, made it one with the apartment. It was the building's hunger now. The figure, if it could still be called that, looked at James with those empty eyes. For a moment their gazes locked, and he felt a flicker of recognition. But it wasn't recognition of him. It was recognition of the hunger, of the endless, devouring need that was pulling them both into the same abyss. You are next. The voice came from the figure's mouth, but the words weren't its own. They were the building's voice, the hunger's voice. James could feel it, deep in his chest, echoing through his bones. The hunger was inside him now, clawing at his mind, and it was only a matter of time before he was just like this, just like the twisted figure in front of him. The walls began to pulse again, the very air vibrating with a terrible energy. James could feel it in his gut, the hunger rising inside him. It was getting harder to breathe. His chest tightened. His heart was pounding in his ears. He staggered backward, his vision spinning, but his legs didn't listen. They carried him forward, dragging him into the next room. The room was familiar, and yet it wasn't. It was the same but different, twisted, distorted. The furniture was piled in strange shapes like an abstract nightmare. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, to writhe. There was something alive here, something watching him. The hunger was stronger now. It was overwhelming, consuming his every thought, his every breath. He could feel it in the walls, in the floor beneath him, in the very air he breathed. It was all part of the same thing, all feeding the same insatiable need. The building, the hunger, him. "You will feed me." The voice was louder now, and this time, it wasn't just in his mind. It was in the room, around him, coming from every corner. The walls were alive, breathing, pulsating with the force of the building's hunger. He could see it now, see the tendrils of darkness, reaching out from the walls, from the floor, wrapping around him, drawing him closer. James tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to move, to fight, but his body wouldn't listen. It was like his very soul was being pulled into the walls, into the dark. The hunger was taking him, pulling him into its gaping maw, and he was powerless to stop it. And then, as though the building itself had exhaled, the darkness deepened, and James felt his vision fade. His body was no longer his own. His limbs were no longer his. His thoughts were no longer his. He was becoming part of the building, part of the hunger that had consumed everything before him. And in that moment, he understood. The building had been alive all along. The hunger was not just a need. It was a force, a primal energy that had existed long before humanity had even begun to comprehend the idea of fear. It was ancient, older than the building itself. It had lived for as long as time had existed, and it would continue to live as long as there were souls to feed on, as long as there was a hunger to be sated. And now James was a part of it. The hunger would never stop, it would never end, and neither would he. James had become one with the building. His body, his soul, had been devoured by its eternal, insatiable need. But it wasn't just his life that had been taken. It was everything. The building had consumed him, and in doing so it had swallowed all of his past, all of his memories, leaving only a hollow shell behind. His soul was now just another piece of the endless, ever-hungry mass that stretched across time and space, feeding on the lost, the broken, the helpless. And the hunger would continue, forever. Das die Taubs. In this expanded version of Chapter 8, we delve deeper into James's loss of self as he is gradually consumed by the building's hunger. The apartment itself has become an organism, a vast living force that devours not only bodies but souls, memories, and identities. James is no longer just a victim. He is now part of the building's insatiable appetite, lost to its infinite hunger, with no escape in sight. Chapter 9. The Eternal Cycle. Time had no meaning in the depths of the building. Days, months, years were all swallowed whole by the hungry darkness. The corridors, once familiar in their twisted way, had become unrecognizable, as though they were constantly shifting, constantly changing to accommodate the building's endless, gnawing hunger. The walls, now slick with something far worse than decay, pulsed with a rhythm, a heartbeat that seemed to echo through the very marrow of James's bones. It was the heartbeat of the building, and it was alive, alive in a way he had never imagined possible. James had ceased to be James. He was not a man anymore. He wasn't even a soul. He was a vessel. He was a part of the hunger now, and there was nothing left of the man he had been. The man who had wandered into this cursed place with the vague hope of escape. The man who had tried to fight. The man who had, at one point, wanted to remember. All of that was gone. The building had devoured him, and in doing so, it had consumed every trace of his humanity. The hunger had been inside him for what felt like centuries, and it had no intention of stopping. No, it was growing. With each soul that it absorbed, with each life it claimed, it grew stronger. And now, they, the souls trapped in this nightmare, were the building's hunger. The lost souls that had long since given up on escape. They had been here for so long that their memories were nothing but echoes, fading whispers in the dark. The hunger had claimed them, and now it was their turn to feed. James could hear them, the whispers, the voices of the others, new victims, trapped in the same torment he had once faced. Their voices were muffled at first, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the building's heartbeat, but then they became clearer, more distinct. They were here now, just as he had been, walking in the shadows of the building, unaware of what was happening to them. They were still alive, and that made them so much more delicious to the building. James had not always been aware of the others. not in the beginning. But now, after so many years, after so many lifetimes of pain, the hunger had changed him. His senses were sharper now, more attuned to the pulse of the building, to the cries of the souls trapped inside its walls. He could hear them, their desperation, their fear. He could taste their panic, their confusion. It was all part of the feast. He could feel them coming. He knew they were near. The building had a way of calling them, drawing them in. It wasn't always the same way. Sometimes it was through whispers on the wind, promises of safety, promises of escape. Other times, it was the allure of something they could not resist, a flicker of light in the distance, a shadowy figure beckoning them forward. They would follow, of course. They always did. It didn't matter how many had come before them, how many had disappeared into the darkness. They would always come, and when they did, they would fall into the same trap, the same endless cycle. They would walk these halls, unaware that the building was already feeding on them, already absorbing them into its flesh. They would become part of the hunger, part of the endless cycle of consumption. They would become lost, just like James had. The first time James had met one of them, one of the new souls, he had tried to warn them. He had tried to shout out, to tell them to run, to leave before it was too late. But the words had never come. His voice had been swallowed by the building, by the hunger. Now, all he could do was watch as they passed him by, oblivious to the fate that awaited them. James watched now from the corner of the dark, his eyes wide and empty, his mind a hollow void. He saw them, the new victims, wandering down the corridor, their faces confused, their eyes wide with terror. They had only just arrived, their senses still untainted, still aware enough to recognize that something was wrong, but not yet desperate enough to understand that there was no escape. He saw a woman in the lead, her footsteps tentative as she moved through the hallway. Her eyes flicked nervously around the room, her breath shallow as she scanned the area for some sign of safety. She had come, just like him, drawn in by the building's call, by its promise of something better. James could see the flash of hope in her eyes, the same hope he had once had before it was ripped away. She wasn't the first, she wouldn't be the last, but she was the one closest. The others followed her, a man, a young girl, a teenager with a broken arm, their eyes wide with the same fear. They had all come seeking answers, seeking salvation, and the building had answered them, had drawn them closer. Now they were part of it. They were part of the hunger. James didn't move. He couldn't move. He was a part of the building now, an extension of its will. But still, he saw them. He saw their fear, and it made the hunger inside him grow. The hunger needed them, wanted them, and soon they would be consumed, just like he had been. The woman took a step forward, and James felt something stir inside him, a spark, faint but unmistakable. A memory, perhaps, a flicker of humanity. Could he save them? Could he stop the building from taking them? No, it was impossible. He knew that now. The hunger couldn't be stopped. He reached out, but his hand passed through the air like a shadow. He had no substance anymore. He was nothing but the echo of a man, lost in the labyrinth of this cursed place. The hunger was all that was left of him. And yet, despite knowing it was hopeless, despite the void inside him, something stirred within him, something almost human. He wanted to scream at them, warn them, tell them to run. Leave, his voice echoed in his mind, but no sound came. The building swallowed his words, absorbed them into its vast, endless maw. The woman moved closer, unaware of the shadow standing in the corner, unaware of the building's dark presence. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the wall, and that was when it happened. The hunger moved. The walls seemed to come alive, shifting in a way that made the ground beneath them tremble. The air grew thick, dense, oppressive. The pulse of the building grew louder, a beating heart that resonated through every inch of the apartment, every corner, every crevice. The woman froze. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized what was happening. Her breath caught in her throat and she tried to turn, to flee, but the walls closed in around her, constricting, squeezing. The others behind her tried to run, but the same fate awaited them. The hunger had already reached out for them, its tendrils wrapping around their bodies, pulling them into the walls. Their screams were muffled, drowned by the vast, endless force that lived within the building. James stood there, watching, feeling the building's insatiable pull as it claimed them one by one. Their forms twisted, distorted, merging with the walls, their screams fading into the oppressive silence that followed. The hunger had fed, it was done, and now the cycle would begin again. James stood, empty, hollow, watching as the building consumed the new victims, as it absorbed them into its dark, infinite hunger. It was the same with every new soul. The building would always hunger for more. And James, he was just another echo, another part of the building's twisted, never-ending feast. There was no escape. There would never be an end. This chapter delves into the cyclical nature of the building's insatiable hunger. James, now part of the building, watches as new victims are drawn in, only to suffer the same fate he did. The hunger grows stronger with each new soul, and the cycle continues, an eternal loop of torment. James has lost all sense of self, but the dark memories of his humanity still linger, even as he watches the new victims fall into the same trap. There is no escape. The building's hunger is unending. Chapter 10. The Scythe of Finality. Time, if it even still existed in this cursed place, had become a thing of the past. James could no longer measure the days, or even the years. Time had no meaning within the walls of this twisted structure. The hunger, that insatiable force, consumed not only flesh but moments, erasing everything in its wake. And James, he had become as much a part of it as the building itself. In the endless blackness of the halls, where the air hung thick with despair and decay, James no longer thought of escape. That hope had long since been crushed beneath the weight of the building's relentless appetite. Now, he was just another soul, another echo of humanity, lost to the dark hunger that festered in the very bones of the place. And yet, despite his transformation, something still stirred within him. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was enough to make him wonder, even if just for a fleeting moment, if salvation was possible. Could he save them? Could he stop the cycle from continuing, from claiming yet another group of unwitting victims? The thought seemed ludicrous, a fool's hope. But still, the question clung to him. He could feel them approaching. They were always drawn here, drawn to the building, as if it had a gravitational pull, an unspoken promise of something better, something beyond. But what awaited them was not freedom. It was annihilation. James saw them before they even reached the first corridor. A man, a woman, a child, and a teenager. The woman was leading the group, her face a mixture of determination and fear. They were strangers to him, yet in a way they were familiar. He had seen them all before. They had come here seeking answers, seeking hope, unaware that the building was already drawing them into its hungry maw. The man's eyes darted nervously as they walked, sensing the wrongness of the place but not understanding its true nature. The teenager limped slightly, his arm wrapped in a crude bandage, his gaze shifting rapidly from side to side, expecting danger but unsure where it might come from. The child clung to the woman's side, eyes wide with innocence, blissfully unaware of the terror that was about to descend upon them. James watched them from the shadows, his form flickering like a pale reflection in a broken mirror. They couldn't see him. They couldn't hear the hollow whispers of the building's hunger that echoed in his mind, urging him to feed. "Please," James whispered to himself, a voice barely audible even to his own ears. "Don't come any closer." But his voice was drowned by the building's pulse, the heartbeat of the structure that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. It was as if the building itself was aware of their arrival, eagerly awaiting their surrender. The woman, leading the group, stopped suddenly. She turned, sensing something. A shift in the air, a whisper in the darkness. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the hallway as if trying to understand what was wrong. But it was already too late. The walls, those once solid barriers, began to shift. Slowly at first, then with terrifying speed, they bent and twisted, as if they had a will of their own. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the walls seemed to pulse with a hunger so deep it shook the ground beneath their feet. James felt the hunger stir within him. He could feel it, the pull, the need for more. It was no longer just a part of him. It was him. And yet, despite everything, a small, flickering part of him still screamed, "Don't let them fall into it. Stop them." But it was futile. The woman turned to run, and that was when the building struck. The walls surged forward like a wave crashing over them, swallowing the space between them and safety. The man behind her shouted in panic, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to rally the others. But the words were swallowed whole by the building's insatiable pulse. The child cried out in fear, clinging to the woman's leg. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. The walls closed in around them. James had seen this before. The way they all struggled, their terror filling the air, only for it to be crushed beneath the weight of the building's hunger. It was always the same. First, the confusion. Then, the realization. And finally, the crushing, soul-deep terror as they were consumed by the very walls they had walked into. The woman screamed as the walls wrapped around her, pulling her into the darkness, her form twisting and distorting as if the building itself was feasting upon her. The others tried to run, but it was pointless. The hunger had already claimed them. The building did not need their consent. It only needed their presence. James stood motionless, watching as they were devoured, as their forms merged with the walls, their screams swallowed by the growing silence that followed. The building's hunger had been sated, for now. And just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. But for James, there was no end. There was no peace. There was only the hunger and the cycle, ever repeating. He felt it. The hunger was still there, still gnawing at him, and he knew that it would never stop. Not until the building had claimed every last soul that dared to enter. Not until it had consumed all of them, body, mind, and spirit. He had become one with the building now, no longer just a man, no longer even a soul. He was the hunger. He was the scythe that cut through the lives of the lost, and he knew that he would never escape. It was the way of the building. It had always been this way. The cycle would continue. The feast would never end. And the lost would continue to arrive, as they always had. And James? He was just another piece in the puzzle, another echo in the darkness, forever trapped in the void of the building's insatiable hunger. There was no escape. There would never be an end. The cycle continued. The hunger never stopped. And James would always be there, watching, waiting, consumed by the endless, eternal cycle of the building's hunger. Epilogue. The silence of eternity. The building stood still, as it always had. Its dark, twisting corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls pulsating with a life of their own, a heartbeat that never faltered. Inside, the air was thick with the lingering echoes of those who had come before, whispers of the lost souls who had once dared to enter, seeking escape, salvation, or something more. But now, there was nothing left to find. The hunger had consumed them all. Time, as it existed in this place, had long since lost its meaning. The minutes, the hours, the years, they no longer mattered. The building continued to feed, its appetite unyielding, insatiable. With every new soul that wandered in, the hunger grew stronger, deeper, more relentless. The walls, once mere structures, had become an extension of that hunger, a vast living entity that knew only one thing: to consume. James had once believed in escape. He had once believed in hope. But now, all that remained was the gnawing emptiness, the knowledge that he was trapped in a cycle that could never end. He had become part of the building, a piece of its insidious machinery, lost to the darkness forever. And yet, even in his final moments, as his humanity faded into nothing, there was a fleeting thought, a glimmer of understanding, of something almost human. He had wanted to save them. He had wanted to stop the cycle, to end the hunger. But he knew, deep down, that the building would always win. It was a force beyond comprehension, beyond anything he or the others could have understood. The others, those who had come after him, had met the same fate. They were now part of the hunger, their memories fading into the walls, their cries swallowed by the darkness. The building would never stop. It would always hunger for more. And so, the cycle continued. Each soul drawn into the web of the building, each person consumed by the ever-growing appetite of its twisted existence. No one was immune. No one could escape. There was no end. There was no beginning. There was only the hunger. And in the silence of eternity, James, like all the others, was nothing more than an echo, a whisper in the darkness, a shadow lost in time.